Thank you everyone for joining us for today's program. We are absolutely delighted you are here to learn with us about the incredible story of women's suffrage as we get ready to celebrate the 100-year anniversary this August. So before I introduce our speaker, I wanted to just take a quick moment to thank our amazing supporters for continuing to help us offer these programs free of charge to our community. We truly and honestly appreciate it. I'd also like to remind you that this is a conversation and that we want to hear from you. So if you have a question you would like to pose, please use the Q&A function you can find by hovering your mouse either at the top of your screen or the bottom of the screen, and that's going to bring up your menu of options. All you have to do is just type right into that Q&A or type right into the chat, and we will be happy to forward your questions on to our amazing speaker. If you're joining us via YouTube, please simply type a comment on our video, and we'll make sure that gets over there as well. If you need to leave early or you want to watch the program later, a recording is going to be made available at the conclusion of the program. So now, without further ado, I'm so excited to tell you a little bit about our speaker today. Donna Kelly has worked in the state archives for 36 years. She began her career with the institution following high school and will be retiring as the head of special collections. In her career, she has worked on numerous projects, including co-editing the papers of James Iredell, Volume 3, 1784 to 1789, indexing the untold story of women of color in the League of Women Voters, and editing a history of the Hayes-Barton neighborhood in Raleigh. Donna is a member of the Historical Society of North Carolina, the Association of Documentary Editing, and the Society of North Carolina Archivists. She also holds degrees from Wake Forest University and North Carolina State University. We are delighted she is joining us today to share some of the amazing artifacts she pulled from the exhibit, An Absolute Moral Certainty, the Women's Suffrage Movement in North Carolina. So Donna, thank you so much for joining us today. We are so delighted you're here.
Thanks, good to be here.
Well, I would love to just kind of kick this off with a very sort of basic question. It's the 100-year anniversary, so tell us, what on earth is the suffrage movement?
Okay, well, first of all, I think most people know what suffrage is, but just in case you don't, it's the right to vote. And so in the 1800s, women were not allowed to vote. And so around the 20s and 30s, some women started getting up like temperance societies and anti-slavery societies, and the women's rights movement began kind of back then, and it kind of gained momentum in 1848 when abolitionists met in Seneca Falls, New York, and decided, well, we really want to try to push for women's rights. So then things just kind of took off from there. They wrote a new Declaration of Independence that included "and women" instead of just "all men are created equal." And the person that organized the Seneca Falls meeting was Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And so she was very instrumental in all of that movement. So then after that, in 1850, Susan B. Anthony joined, and most people are more familiar with her name. And she joined it, and then actually she wrote the first text, and there was an amendment that was proposed to Congress in 1870. But again, it didn't go anywhere. So then gradually they formed the National Women's Suffrage Association. She was the president of that. And there was also another group called American Woman Suffrage Association, but that didn't really have a lot to do in North Carolina, so I'm not going to talk about that. So let me try to share my screen to get going here with some pictures instead of just seeing talking heads. Let's see.
No, I think with the suffrage movement, one of the things that we think about, we're celebrating the 100-year anniversary, but you brought up such an important point. It's this idea that it took hundreds of years to make this happen. I mean, 1776 to 1920, that's a lot of time.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I'm trying to say show slideshow and it's not coming up.
Hit slideshow, the thing at the top, scroll across to the ribbon.
Mm-hmm. I'm not seeing it. Okay.
It's right under the menu next to home. If you moved your mouse just a little bit across,
okay.
Keep going, you'll see slideshow.
See new slide. I don't see slideshow.
up top, you'll see home, insert, design, animation,
Oh,
slideshow.
duh.
There you
Okay,
go.
there it is. Sorry about that.
Technology is always very wonderful until we actually try to do anything. And you think you know where everything is until that exact moment when you have to find
Right. Of
it.
course. Okay.
There you
So,
go. Now you can see
yeah.
it. Perfect.
So, you probably wonder where an absolute moral certainty came from. It actually is the title of the traveling exhibit that the State Archives put together. Um, and so it came from a quote from Governor Thomas Pickett's speech, where he said that once he determined that it was really going to be a certainty that it got ratified, he said, it's going to be an absolute moral certainty, so you might as well ratify it. So that's where that comes from. And here's a slide showing what the She Changed the World logo that's down in the bottom corner, and that was the departmental initiative. And we started meeting about 2 years ago to start making big plans for all of this. And we had a big kickoff event last September at the state capitol, and the exhibit was on display there. And then it started traveling around before the COVID-19 hit. So it's kind of been obviously put on hold. But we do have some virtual versions of it online, and I think I've sent Lauren some URLs so they can be put in the chat box, and people can have access to that. And here's a picture. I mentioned the two women that were instrumental in getting it started. So Susan B. Anthony's on the left. This is an older image of both of them. And I really like this image. This is something I didn't really know. I did not really know that in the western part of the country, the vote started before, before the 1920. And so I guess they thought that women were more equal to men out in the frontier, and they wanted to encourage more women to be there to increase the population. There's various theories on why that happened. So I just really like Columbia. This comes from a New York Times article that I saw. So, and then here's another thing about that. The voters are out west. It says, why deny our rights in the East? So that I saw this picture and I just thought it would be a nice one to include just from the national perspective. These images don't come from our collection, but a lot of them later on will come from our collection. So, in fact, here's one of the first ones. If you've got any questions, go ahead and stop me. I don't need to keep rambling on if we want to.
No, I think you're going right to exactly what I was about to ask you.
Okay.
What does this look like and why were there objections? Because I think today we think of this as being the right to vote is something that's kind of integral to our experience here.
Well,
it's about that kind of having your voice. And
yeah,
why do people object?
Yeah, and this is another surprising thing. I just always thought of suffragists as progressives, and I never thought that they would have supported white supremacy. But there you go. Here's one of the flyers that was put out. So that was one of the reasons they were trying to squelch the objections, because they said, oh, color's not going to be included in any of these arguments. So you don't need to worry about that. And the other reasons were they thought, well, women need to be involved in the political process. There'll be more educated women can vote. And it's a shame that poor white men that are uneducated can vote, and then more widely respected, educated women can't. They just didn't see any reasoning behind that. So that was part of it. But back to North Carolina's connection, in 1894, we formed our own, the Equal Suffrage Association. And that's when it really started taking off in North Carolina. It hadn't really done much before then. Even though in the 80s and 90s, there had been a lot of movement toward volunteer groups forming and civic organizations, and more women were getting involved that way. But the arguments, well, I can get to the arguments later, but the arguments were they didn't want women out of the home. They thought women needed to be put on a pedestal, and that they just were, that men voted for women, men represented women. There was no reason for the women to have the vote, because it would disrupt the family and just all those kinds of things. So that's sort of, in a nutshell, some of the arguments that were reasons why for and against it.
So we see a lot where having to do with it, they don't want to disrupt the status quo. They're afraid of things changing, afraid of what the getting the vote would mean for both the public and the private sphere, fears about what it means for equal rights, really, and for thinking about those kind of things.
Yeah, yeah. So what happened again? 1897, North Carolina tried to pass the amendment. It was a form of it was proposed by a representative from Yancey County, and well, here's another example of speaking for yourself. He proposed the bill in 1897, and it didn't go anywhere. It was basically tabled because it was sent to the Committee on Insane Asylums. But
you have to
don't
tell me
jump.
more about that.
Yeah, I know. Everybody says, well, that's just because they thought it was an insane idea. Well, no, not really. It was because he was the chair of that committee, and so that's probably why they pushed it there. But I'll show you a slide of that later. But what I've got here are some more propaganda pieces. This is a fan that was used. And this is a calendar. This was very colorful. This is not North Carolina. It's in our collection. All the things I'm going to show from here on are things in our collection. And anyone can come to the archives once we're open again and see these things. There are a lot of them are in, we have an Equal Suffrage Association collection. Then we also have the Gertrude Wheel papers. She was the first president of the Suffrage Association in North Carolina. But let's see, I've got a few more. And another thing, as I said earlier, one of the reasons they said, oh, well, we'll have better babies if women can vote. You see, on the left, it says, I wish my mother had a vote to keep the germs away. And I thought that was kind of appropriate today, given how we're all focusing on keeping germs away. So I threw that one in there. This is another example of other countries that had the right to vote before we did. And this was just another colorful example I decided to use. And then one of the arguments of the anti-suffragists were that, you know, women don't really want the vote. But then here's an example. This was used in our exhibit, this piece. And I cropped a lot of these. So, you know, they're not this pristine looking. Some of them have torn edges, and they're very fragile documents. They're on that old yellowing paper, a lot of them. So when you're using the collection, you'll find a lot of crumbs that come out because, you know, they're acidic, and I mean, you can still handle them. No, I'm not saying that, but it's just you have to be careful. So this is just an example of another flyer that was used. And then 12 reasons why they should vote. You didn't want to have the vote would increase the sense of responsibility, public-spirited mothers, you know, several things. And all of these are also, I say all, a lot of these have been digitized. And I think I sent a link, or if you go to the digital collections of North Carolina online, it has a category on 20th century women. And so a lot of these documents have been digitized and are available. So if you can't read it on screen right quick, you can, you know, they're there. So back to the bill, here's the back of the bill, and you can see insane asylum is written out to the side there. So I just thought that was, you know, very, very odd that they did that, but that's what they did. And then just here's another map of showing what other states had already gotten the vote before 1914. Again, I said I never knew this. I just assumed that none of the states. I mean, I never learned it in school. I don't know why it wasn't more of a topic that was covered. Because it was such an important milestone in our history. I guess
that's why we need museums and why we need archives.
Yeah. Well, I guess I shouldn't say this, but maybe it's because a lot of the men maybe wrote the textbooks. I don't know. I'm just saying. Okay. Anyway. So this is Gertrude Wheel. She was the president of our group, the association, and she was from Goldsboro, very, very active. We have lots of her papers. In fact, a lot of these materials that you'll see came from her papers. And she was the first president of the group. And then she became the first president of the League of Women Voters when it came to the fore. And this is a picture of the Equal Suffrage Association headquarters. In the center, there's a little dog, and he has a little sash around his neck called Votes for Women. That was one of the things that they used to promote. And I have a slide showing that down the road, but I just thought this, and this is located in Raleigh on Fayetteville Street. And here's another group shot. The man in the front's holding a little baby, and it says Battalion of Male Sympathizers. So there were a few men. I mean, some men did support it, surprisingly, because you would think they would be opposed, but they weren't. And Gertrude Will is on the far left, as I've said. So, and here's the sash that and purple and gold and white were the colors that were used for the effort. So this is going to start a run of anti-suffrage things. So if you wanted to ask me any more questions about something else before we get into that, that's fine. Or
yeah, I know from the exhibit that what you guys did is you had kind of the for camp and the against camp,
right.
kind of showing a lot of the different arguments there. So I'm really curious to hear a little bit more about what the against the anti-suffragists just did, what their strategy was.
Yeah, they didn't really get started until 1920. Because everybody just assumed it would just die. Nobody, it was such an outrageous proposition. Nobody thought that the vote would pass. And so when it actually passed in Congress in January of 1920, the anti-suffrage group were like, uh-oh, we need to get our act together and push against this. And so there were some groups formed in all across the country, but in North Carolina, there was trying to think. Mary Hilliard Hinton was the head of the anti-suffrage group, and she was in charge of the state branch of the Southern Rejection League, and they were trying to reject this notion. And so this is
a woman that's leading this in North Carolina.
I know, and this is one of the particularly thing. Talking about race again, they said, well, heed not the song of the suffrage siren kind of thing, and it was just trying to scare people into supporting it.
Oh yeah, we see a lot of fear. We see a lot of, I mean, one of the things that I think people forget, 1920 is in the height of Jim Crow South.
Exactly.
We see a lot of things that obviously today we're really examining and seeing what is the legacy of this moment. And I think people forget that the suffrage movement is really taking place right in the midst of all of these incredible moments of change, of fear, of all of these different pieces. And so, it's scary to see things like that today, and to read that particular document is horrifying.
Yeah. So I kind of switch back and forth. This is the getting back to the national picture. Between 1910 and 1914, as I showed you on the map earlier, a lot of states had already passed the suffrage movement, and then Wilson finally agreed to it because it was such a grassroots effort. And so here's a picture, and I think this is in New York. And even after the war, because women had contributed so much to the war effort, they formed Red Cross societies, and they took on jobs that men had previously held, and they raised money. So, this is an example of the soldiers trying to say, she's given me to democracy, give democracy to her. So I thought that was an important angle. There were so many angles we could have used with all the documents. There was the tie-in with the Civil War connection and the World War I connection, and the labor issues. A lot of the people who supported the textile industry, they were opposed to women's suffrage because they didn't want any restrictions on the child labor laws. That was another driving force behind some of it. So this is I mentioned 1920, but even before that, in 1919, when it passed in Congress, North Carolina they had to ratify. 36 states had to ratify. So this is the copy of the cover letter that came to North Carolina. And the next three documents are stored in our vault. So they are not available to the public, but they are on display when we've gone out. So they can come out. They have to be in a special case. So then this is the cover letter. And then this is the certification of the document, saying that it is an exact copy. And then the joint resolution that was in Congress. So those three are what's on display usually. But
I think What's so cool about this exhibit and so cool about this moment is that you guys are actually literally pulling things out of the vault that are so fragile that they can't be on display.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so you're getting to see this kind of piece of North Carolina history.
Yeah. Yeah. So that I just yeah. So as I said, North Carolina was like they had already passed in 35 states. So when it got down to the wire, um, I might be jumping ahead of myself, but this drawing, I found this, I've never seen this anywhere else. It's the love me not kind of thing. So in the middle, it says North Carolina legislature. So everybody was looking to North Carolina to see if they were going to vote for it or against it. So I just really like this image, and you can see the pine trees, so you kind of know that it's relating to North Carolina. This was in this magazine, Woman Citizen magazine.
And that's something I find so interesting about this is I did not realize until we were coming up on the 100-year anniversary just how important North Carolina's
Mhm.
role was in this moment. I had
Mhm.
no idea that it came down to North Carolina and Tennessee to make this decision. And I love this drawing. I've actually never seen this either. I love that the kind of propaganda that
Yeah.
this movement was using and kind of playing it out in the magazines, playing it out in the newspapers, and
Mhm.
the
Mhm.
fact that North Carolina had such an integral role. Now, I have a feeling you're going to kind of dash my hopes here in a second about North Carolina. But so tell me a little bit about what happens.
Yeah, okay. So after that, this is what happened. The when it came to North Carolina in 1919 it didn't pass, and then we went on to 1920, and the anti-suffragists really got going in April, and they were doing a lot of their um, going against things. And I don't know where it happened to all of my anti-suffrage things, but anyway, the 63 members of the legislature in North Carolina said, well, we just don't want this to happen. So they sent this telegram to the legislature in Tennessee, and they said, if we're not going to vote for it, so we don't want you to vote for it either. And we just want to make sure that we're on the same page here. You're like our daughter. You came from us and everything. And so, but that I never knew that. I never knew that there was this push from North Carolina to discourage other states from voting. So yeah, that was kind of a black mark against us that way. So yeah.
I think the fact that we're thinking about in 1920 talking about, well, you were our daughter state, you came from us, you should vote like us, and the fact that they're going and sending these telegrams and trying to defeat this is just a fascinating
No,
story.
no, it just really was. Um, so I somehow these got out of order. But anyway, this is
That's the best of
back to the
us.
Mary Hilliard Hinton, just to talk about the reasons not to get it passed. So if we're backing up a little bit in time, um, who knows why she was opposed to it? I guess just some women were happy with their role as a mother and wife, and they didn't really have any notion to be involved in politics. So anyway, um, here's an article. This is there were lots of cartoons, and we have a lot of those digitized. This one was in the collection. It's just you see the anti-suffrage just trying to pull the coattails. They didn't want it to pass, and so that's a version of that. And that brings up another point. A lot of people say suffragette. That was the term that was used in England, and over here we are used suffragist with the ist on the end. So when you're talking about it, it's the correct way is suffragist instead of suffragette. Um, and then I mentioned the Southern Rejection League. Men formed the States' Rights League, obviously because they wanted to support states' rights. They were not in favor of a federal amendment to the Constitution telling the states what to do, so they were opposed to it. So if you look over to the left arrow, their headquarters was right there on Fayetteville Street, and then just a few doors down, you can see the NC Equal Suffrage Association. So they were literally, next door to each other on Fayetteville Street. I found that kind of ironic as well.
That had to make for a very interesting walk to work in the morning.
It did. Yep. And then so here's some more slides about the reasons to not give women the right to vote, because people were afraid that black candidates would emerge and they would get office, and they had, they had already been through that during the fusionist movement, and they had gotten rid of after Reconstruction, reformed everything, and the Democrats had taken back over control of things, and they didn't want because black men had held office during Reconstruction, and then the Wilmington coup of 1898. After that, and then subsequent events, Jim Crow took over again, and so that's where we see some of the fear
Yeah,
mongering that
I
went
mean,
on.
we see in North Carolina in the 1870s, we see a lot of real strides happening for African Americans to be able to hold public
Yeah.
offices, to be able to vote, to have says. We know that there's a lot of stuff that's happening in Charlotte, in particular, where I am today,
Mhm.
with African American business leaders that are managing to really kind of carve out an important political space for them. And then by the 1920s, we see the kind of rise of white supremacy again
Mhm.
in this
Mhm.
moment. And so it's fascinating and horrifying to see that this movement is really tied in with that,
Mhm.
and that kind of broader national and that broader Southern movement that we see kind of happening here. And it's interesting, it comes down to two Southern states.
Mhm.
And so
Mhm.
we've kind of talked a little bit about this, but I had a couple questions come through about why exactly was North Carolina so opposed to this? We know it has to do with this kind of fear of sort of upsetting this world that they had tried to create that was based in the Jim Crow South. But
Mhm.
what other reasons do we have? I know you.
It was mainly the states' rights issue, and a lot of what I said, the textile manufacturers and railroad tycoons, people didn't want anything to upset the way things were. They didn't want restrictions on the child labor, and they just didn't want change. I think that was a lot of it. They just didn't want that. I think that was, and they didn't want, like I said, a federal constitution, the amendment to the Constitution determining who could vote in North Carolina, and that's part of it. Um, this is another thing about talking about how it would destroy the family. That's another reason. It's kind of funny. They've got the rooster on the eggs, keeping the eggs warm, and this comes. There's a larger broadside that this came from, but you can see again they used a fan. That was a very prevalent form of propaganda to use for the fan. So this was just glued to the thing. So I think I told you yesterday, in March, we did a mini version of this exhibit. And so we had to use facsimiles of everything to put it out in our search room. And I was determined I was going to get these fans just right. So I really worked hard to make good facsimiles of them. So maybe if we ever open back up and the exhibit is still on display, people can see my handiwork in the fans. But it was fun to try to recreate those. And this one I think is a hoot. This household hints. They just were opposed to things. You can't really see this, but it says you do not need a ballot to clean out your sink spout. I mean, so it's, and then spot removers. It's just all these little things, and there is, however, no method known by which mud-stained reputations may be cleaned after bitter political campaigns. So they were using like this kind of stuff, housewives type stuff, to say, yeah, you don't need to worry about the vote. So I just found that funny, and here's another few little blurbs about why you didn't need to vote, because eligible women that were eligible to vote were married, and that would only double their husband's vote, or if they voted a different way, it would nullify how the husband had voted. So that was some of the logic that was used. um, and then here we go again, another thing: we plead in the name of Virginia Dare that North Carolina remain white. I just thought, oh my God, I can't believe they they went to those lengths, but that was just a theme that ran throughout, mainly on the anti-suffragist side. But as you saw earlier, the suffragists also used the race card, and I haven't mentioned anything much about it, but obviously during this time, Black women were not allowed to participate in the organizations that were formed. They did kind of, they worked in the background in their churches and other groups, but it was a segregated society in all manner. I mean, even ironically, you would think that all the women would band together, whatever their color, but no, it was just very much a segregated society back then too. So,
I think that's
um,
why I love that story about Ida B. Wells marching in that the national parade, and
mhm.
she was asked to march at the back, and so she disappeared. And in the middle of the parade, she jumps in, she links arms with the people in from Illinois, the Illinois delegation, and marches. And I think it's those moments of
Yeah,
people kind of taking charge, and really
right.
those moments when people are sitting there and saying, no, this is not okay. And we
Yeah.
definitely see those kind of beginnings of some of these movements here. And I find that particular story
Mhm,
incredibly motivating.
mhm.
And I know we have a couple of heroes in North Carolina who are doing things like that as well.
Yeah, Charlotte Hawkins Brown was a big proponent in education, and that was the other thing. A lot of women were just they were trying to overcome the education barrier, the economic barrier, and so they were pushing. They didn't. Um, I've got a quote I find from a letter that Gertrude Will wrote to Walter Clark. He was an associate and then Chief Justice of the North Carolina Supreme Court. She was trying to convince a legislator to support suffrage, and she couldn't do it. And so she said, I flattered myself that I had made a profound impression on him, but alas, he was possessed even to the end with the fear that women will leap from their pedestals if allowed to vote. And I almost titled the exhibit leaping from their pedestals, because I just saw that image. I mean, you've just always seen the image of the lost cause and the woman, and the almost worship. Women are just perfect. They're perfect creatures. They don't need to get down into the dirty politics of voting. And so that was, I just thought that quote was pretty neat. So that's it.
Definitely. I have a wonderful question that I'd love
Okay.
to ask from one
Mhm.
of our audience members here. We've talked a little bit about how, kind of in the lead up to this, that it was a very sort of segregated society, and that winning the right to vote did not necessarily mean that everyone got the right to vote.
Right.
So, when do we see that becoming a little bit more universal? Um,
Well, 1924, Native Americans gained citizenship, but I've heard varying stories. I've heard that sometimes, some they got the right to vote then, but then I've heard no, they didn't really get the right to vote till the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So I don't really know, but of course, black folks didn't get the right to vote obviously till 1965, and even then they were subject to the literacy tests and things. And even my own mother said in the early 60s when she went to vote, um, or no, I guess it was the later 60s, she had to copy the Constitution. I mean, that was, even white people had to do the same thing, I guess, to show that they were not being prejudiced, but they were. When people, they were trying it was voter suppression, similar to the gerrymandering today. People, the things, the way the districts are carved out, it's very, it's a blatant to me, voter suppression. So we're still fighting some of the battles that they were working on even back then, 100 years ago.
I think probably part of what being an active citizen is
Mhm.
constantly pushing, resisting, and moving. And we see
Yeah.
a lot of lessons from that in history.
Right.
And we see a lot of things that people are doing
Hmm.
to make this possible. Now, I'd love to hear just a little bit more about what happens in 1920. What happens in North Carolina? Because it's a fascinating story.
Well, the I mean, as I've told you, this the anti-suffragists started growing in the spring and then early summer, and then the state legislature got the bill the, to be ratified, and then it just was not going to happen. But the governor was switched over. Tom Bickett decided that he was going to support it, so he spoke to the legislature trying to get them to vote for it, and the vote was like 25 to 23. They just put it off, and they said, "Oh, well, we'll just do it next year. We'll vote on it next year because we haven't had a chance to talk to our constituents about it. We don't know where they stand, so we don't want to support anything if it's not something that everybody wants. So even after it passed in August 26th of 1920, the legislature in North Carolina were like, well, no, we're not, we don't need to, we don't need to worry about it. And so, and again, I did not know this until recently. We did not ratify the 19th Amendment in North Carolina until May the 6th of 1971. And I just was like, oh my gosh, I couldn't believe that. And I think the only reason it was done then was because that was in the height of the fight for the Equal Rights Amendment. And so that was probably the only reason it passed. So it's kind of embarrassing to think that we were like the next to the last state to ratify. I mean, it's pretty sad to think. And I also think it's so ironic that, we sent that telegram to Tennessee to pushing for them not to vote, and then they're the ones that put us over the top to actually have it ratified and become law. So there's kind of a lot of ironies in the story.
Mm-hmm. Oh, and it came down to the last moment in Tennessee. There's a fascinating new documentary or movie that was created by PBS about the vote. And you're sitting on the edge of your seat looking at this because it came down to literally the last second whether it was going to pass.
Yeah.
And North Carolina, of course, said we're not going to vote,
Yeah.
and passed it to Tennessee, hoping they were going to vote it down and thinking probably that they were going to vote it down. So it's an, and we think of it as kind of 100 years later being over and done. We know how this ends. It's the same thing with the American Revolution. It's the same thing with all of these moments in history. Sitting here in the 21st century, we go, well, of course it worked out. We know how it's going to end, but
yeah,
as you've shown from a lot of these documents that you all have, it's just definitely was not decided. It was a very contentious issue with lots of different viewpoints, different sides. Do you see anything in those archives about the kind of intersection between women's suffrage and prohibition in North Carolina?
There were some, not a whole lot. I mean, there might be some mention in some correspondence, but I didn't see any official, stances that anybody took. But there definitely was a relationship. Most of the suffragists were anti-prohibition. I mean, they were prohibitionists, I believe. And then of course, they were mostly anti-slavery as well, even though the white supremacy. I mean, it's kind of like a paradox. I don't know. It had to be a very confusing time for some people back then.
I think we see in other places, of course, that kind of a real strong intersection between the temperance movements and women's suffrage and things like that. Especially, I imagine, and I could be completely wrong. Please correct me. I'm thinking that the textile industry was really sort of where a lot of this was going to be tied to, especially in 1920, where North Carolina and Charlotte has actually been dry since 1905 by this point, and North Carolina has been dry for a while.
Yeah.
I imagine the textile industry and kind of the debates over child labor may have had a little bit more of an influence.
Yeah, I think that I ran across that more in things that I saw. And an interesting angle that I didn't realize, a former colleague of mine that worked at the state archives, but I believe I'm not sure if she's at University of Florida now, Elna Green, did a big study of anti-suffragists, and she says she found out for some reason a lot of them were Episcopalian. I mean, it was kind of an odd thing to kind of pull out of the records, but that was what she was able to find. So I don't know how that ties in, but that was just an oddity that I discovered in what she said. So.
And I love digging through archives and getting a chance to kind of see people's voices come out and understand. And obviously, you've spent a lot of time with these documents. What was the most interesting and the most surprising document you came across, or just the one that when you held it, you went, wow?
Oh gosh, there were so many. I guess the beware thing was just like, oh my gosh, I can't believe they actually felt that way about trying to scare people into being against suffrage, and that was one of the things. I did have a lot of help with going through the documents. I had a volunteer, Andy Poole, worked a lot last spring. He was very meticulous, and he would abstract a lot of the documents and pull out good quotes and write down why he felt that they would be important. So he was very instrumental in helping us suss out what was good and what would be good visually. And as it turns out, we could only use about, our cases were so small, so the we had 4 documents in the pro-suffrage, and then 4 documents in the anti-suffrage, and then 4 or 5 documents showing the different, the 1897 bill, and then the 1920 amendment, and then the 1971 ratification document. They were in a case by themselves. So it was it was fun. I mean, it was a lot of work, but it was a lot of fun too. A lot of, when you see something come together like this, it and the importance of it too is um, it means a lot. And I hope people will go online and see the traveling, the version of the traveling exhibit. Most of those documents are from our collection. So, and anybody can come once we're back open. As I said, anybody can come to the search room and see these documents, except the ones in the vault. All the other ones are open to the public. Um, they can come and go through what they want to, and go different, look at different angles of things, and maybe find something else out that we didn't discover yet. So,
And that's what's, I think, so great about archives, and particularly the state archives. You guys have been wonderful to us at the museum. We've, of course, had some really great things come to us from the things that you house. We actually have gotten a chance to see some of the things, like the initial sort of granting of the land to create
mhm.
Charlotte, all of these things. And the archives are just such a great place for exploration. And the idea that you can hold something and you
I
can see
know,
something.
I know. Well,
Mhm.
it just, yeah, I never get tired of that. I mean, it's just fascinating to be able, and I think we're, I don't know for sure, but I don't know that all of the state archives allow people to actually hold materials. Or if they do, they have to use gloves. I mean, obviously that's probably better in handling them for preservation purposes, but yeah, and people can make copies. They can bring their cameras in, phones, and take pictures, and you know, that's that's one way to do it. And it's an easy place to work. And we've got very talented staff in our reference unit that can answer questions and help direct people in whatever research they're interested in. Suggest particular records to use. These records all come from our mostly come from our private collections, and the special collections is what the part that I had. But we also have a lot of government documents. I mean, obviously the bills came from the General Assembly session records, and the speech came from the governor's papers. So we have all the governor's papers going back, and um, we have county records, and some municipal records, maps, photographs. We also have a regional facility in Asheville and in Manio. So we reach across the whole state. So,
Well, and it's great. You've got so many documents, so many collections, so many ways of kind of looking at this story, and be able to include so many different voices in
yeah,
this from all of those documents.
yeah.
I have a couple of great questions from our audience here, particularly about that exhibit and about the documents that you have.
Hmm.
The first one I have is we have a guest who was wondering, did you include anything from the Meredith College suffrage just archives?
No, because this was just for the state archives, so we did not branch out and use any other collections. In fact, we were supposed to have a big event there in April 6th, and I'm sure they would have probably had their own stuff on display, but unfortunately that got canceled with everything else. So
Well, one of the things that I love is just how everything is going digital and how we
I
have such
know.
access to things now. And you guys have obviously been leading the charge for years on digitizing things.
Hmm.
And so getting to kind of see those and have quick and easy access to things. And obviously you've put the exhibit online, which is great. I've of course looked through it, and it was so great to get to see some of those things. But how long did it take you guys to create that exhibit?
Well, as I said, we started last spring, or it might have been the spring before. Everything blurs together these days. But the real push was last spring when we finally decided on the documents. We had to check with our conservationists to make sure everything was could be put on display, because you have to worry about the light levels and the temperature, and where they were going to be stored. So we worked with the League of Women Voters, and they were going to work in different counties to have places. Um, so we had to make the selection, then we had to have the assessment by the conservator, and once that was decided, then I wrote all the labels and text, and then we had panels to go with it, and decided to just go with the angle of pro and against as the two angles, because we had such good examples that would be visually appealing. It's harder to think this. When I first started in archives, we would never have exhibited things. That was just not, you just did not do that. People could come and use them in the archives, but they were stored away in the closed stacks. But now, in the past few years, it's become more of a practice in our archives, at least, to showcase documents and to travel them around, because everybody can't come to Raleigh to see things. And so I understand why, but we do have to be careful. We can't just take the Bill of Rights out every other month. It takes a lot of planning, and we've got these exhibit cases, and we have a sequence where we have to fit it in our van. It has to just fit just so, all the exhibit materials and everything. So it took a lot of hands to get it done. Our marketing department actually helped design the color scheme and the logo, and we printed out and mounted a lot of the stuff. So yeah, it was a lot of effort, but I think it turned out really well. I'm proud of it. One of the last things I did in my career that I feel very proud of.
I was going to say, I think that's a good note to end
Yeah.
a very long and very productive career on, is something, a big exhibit celebrating this 100-year anniversary. And especially when it comes to exhibits, there's always this kind of balancing act of it. We want to make sure that we make things accessible. We want people to see things. We want them to engage with these materials.
Right.
But at the same time, we want to make sure that those materials are here past this 100-year anniversary. We want people in 200 years to be able to see them.
Right. Yeah. I mean, the one thing we had to do where we had gaps, because we don't have a lot of records from the Black women who were, like I said, Charlotte Hawkins Brown. So I tried to put some text in the panels, that kind of like a descriptive panel that told the story, the efforts beginning in 1894, and then the anti-suffrage stuff, and then the final ratification. So the panels did some of the explanation to fill in some of the gaps where we did not have actual illustrations of documents themselves.
And hopefully the more that people see these kind of documents and see these stories, and the more things get digitized, we'll be able to kind of have some of those documents
I
moving
hope so.
forward.
We really, I mean, it's important. People don't understand how, I mean, we've started a new initiative called Your Story, and we're trying to collect information from people now while history's happening with the COVID-19 and the racial tension. We're it's and that'll be important, just as these documents were important to me doing this exhibit. 100 years from now, documents that we're collecting now will be important to those people. So as historians and archivists, we have to stop and think about that. But again, it's a different angle to think about, well, I'm collecting history right now. Journals and diaries, and people are sending us photos and things. So it's
Oh, I'm so glad to hear that you guys are getting a lot of that information, and that, I'm glad that this exhibit is available. I'm glad that you guys were able to tell the story. I'm glad people are sending you these documents.
Yeah.
Obviously, we at the museum are very passionate about making sure that history is preserved and saved, and that we have these stories. And just think how incredible that is, that your documents, your ideas, the things that you lived through could go into be in the state archives.
Yeah, I know. And in fact, I should put in a plug for our Museum of History. What they're collecting, of course, the artifacts connected with the current events. Just like we're collecting the documents and the photographs, they're collecting the three-dimensional materials, masks, and so forth.
And we at the museum, if you're interested in learning more about those two projects, we've been sharing both of those on our social feeds. So check out our Facebook page. You'll see the links to all of the information, as well as go directly to the two websites in order to go to share your items, because your items, your stories could be in the state archives. They could be in at the North Carolina Museum of History.
Yeah.
Well, we are coming to the end of our program here, so I want to give you just a moment to kind of give us a little bit of the last word here. Don't worry, it doesn't have to be anything too incredibly profound or anything like that. But we just so thank you for joining us for this, for getting to hear this story. And I know I've asked you a little bit, and you kind of touched on this a bit already, but I would just really love to hear, as we're celebrating the 100-year anniversary next month, why is this so important? And what do you hope that people really learn, take away from North Carolina's story of this?
Well, I do hope that they really appreciate the efforts that these women and men went through, the lengths that they went to give us the vote. The vote wasn't given to us; it was earned. I mean, we had to fight for it and get people to ratify the amendment. And also, it just shows that women's rights are an important issue. They were back then as now, and hopefully, it will spur people to support the Equal Rights Amendment going forward, and pay equity issues, racial equity. There's just so many things that are still happening today that we need to work on, and it takes lots of people coming together to make change. And I think this is an important part of our history, just like it was in 1920 with the passage of the suffrage amendment. So
Well, I think that's a great point. It's the idea that it takes people, it's people's stories, it's people's history, it's the things that they're doing, and the resisting, the persisting, and the moving forward.
right.
And so I hope that people will continue to stay engaged with both of our organizations as we move forward through this 100-year anniversary, as well as moving forward through a very interesting year, to say the least. um, so I appreciate everyone joining us today. And thank you so much, Donna, for joining us. I have so enjoyed this conversation, and it was so much fun for me as a historian to get to see all of these incredible documents.
Yeah. Well, I apologize for the technical difficulties at the beginning.
You have not been on a Zoom program if you have not had at least one technical difficulty. That's how it works. So
this is my first one that I've actually been presenting, so
well,
I've never done it before.
well, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you to our audience for joining us. Thank you to our supporters for making things like this possible. Please continue to stay engaged with both of our organizations. Check out our all of our social pages, and figure out how you can get involved. So thank you, Donna, for joining us. I hope everyone has a wonderful, wonderful rest of their Thursday today.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.